the insistence upon trouble and suffering as an intrinsic element of human experience. So you could say we could concentrate on subjective experience. What's your life like to you? How do you experience it? And we could say, well, built into that is trouble. Built into that is chaos. Built into that is anxiety and pain and disease, and that you can fall prey to those things without there being something wrong with you. Now, you know, if you pin down a psychoanalyst like Jung or Freud, they would of course admit that human misery is endemic to human experience, but Freud in particular tended to look for adult psychopathology in childhood misadventure, in pathological childhood experience. And he at least implicitly claimed that if you hadn't experienced childhood trauma and you had developed properly, that what would happen is that you would end up healthy, roughly speaking, certainly mentally sound. But the existentialists, they don't really buy that perspective right from the beginning. They basically make a different claim, which is that life is so full of intrinsic misery, let's say, but suffering is a better way of thinking about it, suffering that manifests itself as a consequence of your intrinsic vulnerability, that psychopathology is built into the human experience. There's no real way of avoiding it, or at least there's no reason to look for extra causes. That might be a better way of thinking about it. And you'd be surprised how often that sort of observation is useful for clinical clients, for example, because one of the things that's quite characteristic about people, especially if they're introverted and they don't have very many friends, they don't have people to talk to, if they're suffering, maybe they're depressed or anxious, or they have some sets of strange symptoms like agoraphobia or obsessive compulsive disorder, one of the things they always presume that is that the fact that they're suffering in that manner means that there's something, not only something wrong with them, but something uniquely wrong with them, so that it's their fault and no one else is like them. And one of the things you do as a diagnostician, you know, you'll hear a lot of rattling about how labeling is bad for people, and certainly mislabeling is bad for people, and even an accurate label can be a box that you can't get out of. But it's very, very frequently the case that if you diagnose someone, it's a relief to them like you can't believe, because they come in to see you knowing that something isn't going properly, but they think, well, they're the only person facing it, and that means they're idiosyncratically strange in some incomprehensible way that no one else could possibly understand, and there's no way they could ever get better. And one of the things you do is point out to them is like, yeah, depression and anxiety doesn't really require any explanation, right? There's plenty of reason. I don't remember who said it. Everyone has sufficient justification for suicide. I think that was the claim. Well, but the point is that if you look through the experiences of the typical person, unless they're very, very fortunate, and they won't be that way forever, that's certainly the case, that they can point to traumatic experiences in their life, death and loss and illness and humiliation and all those sorts of things, that are sufficient to account for existence in a state of quasi-permanent negative emotion. Now, often if you see, as I said, if you see people who are depressed and anxious by nature, they assume that everyone else is the smiling face that you see on Facebook, and so that alienates them from other people and themselves even more than certainly far more than necessary. And part of the psychoeducation that goes along with therapy is merely educating people to understand that a fair bit of misery is the norm, and that there's plenty of genuine reason for it. And so the existentialists basically start from that stance. It's like a fall of man stance in some sense, you know, because deeply rooted in the Western tradition, roughly speaking, is the idea that people are divorced from some early paradisal state, and that it was the emergence of something like self-consciousness that produced that demolition of humanity and left us in a damaged state. And I mean, people think they don't believe that, but they believe it all the time. And it's frequently how people experience themselves, you know, as if there's something wrong that needs to be rectified. And it seems unique in some sense to human beings. It doesn't seem all that obvious that animals think that way. but people definitely think that way. And so, well, the existentialists basically take that as a given. And then they offer another question, which is, well, given that that's your lot and that there's ample reason for misery, how is it that you should conduct yourself? Because merely, say, giving into that misery or multiplying it doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to do anything but multiply it. It doesn't seem to do anything but increase it. Now, so if it's bad to begin with, you might say, well, increasing it is definitely going to be, increasing it is something that you have to regard as worse. So how do you conduct yourself in the face of misery? Okay, so how do they present that to begin with? Well, this is from Pascal, and this is an existential statement that describes the position of the individual in the universe, you might say, or you could say that it explains a deep characteristic of individual experience or existence, hence existentialism. When I consider the brief span of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and behind it, the small space that I fill or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not, and which know not me, I am afraid, and wonder to see myself here rather than there. For there's no reason why I should be here rather than there, or now rather than then. And so that's an element of existential thinking that is shared with the phenomenologists called thrownness. And that's a term that Heidegger originated, if I remember correctly. And what it means is it's an analysis of a certain characteristic of human experience, which is that, well, there was an immense span of time in which you could have been born, but you weren't born then, you were born 20 years ago, and there was an immense span of time in the future that you could have been born, and you weren't born then either. You were born when you were born, and you're who you are, and you have exactly the characteristics that you have. And there's something tremendously arbitrary about that. It's as if you were thrown into experience, and that's what thrownness means. It means that you were randomly placed in a place and time, and there's something fundamentally irrational about that, meaning that there's no real way of understanding it. It's something you have to deal with. And you might say, well, why was I born poor? Or why was I born less attractive than I might be? Or why was I born less intelligent than I might be? Or maybe why was I born to these terrible parents at this particular horrible moment in time? And in some sense, there's no answer to questions like that. It's just how it is. And you have to deal with it. So the question is, for the existentialists, how do you deal with that? This is Walter Kaufman, if I note Rolomé. Rarely has the existential question been put more simply or beautifully. In this passage we see first the profound realization of the contingency of human life, which the existentialists call thrownness. Second, we see Pascal facing unflinchingly the question of being there, or more accurately, being where. Third, we see the realization that you cannot take refuge in some superficial explanation of time and space, which Pascal, scientist that he was, could well know. And lastly, the deep shaking anxiety arising from this stark awareness of existence in such a universe. There's a fairly well-developed line of social psychological theorizing known as terror management theory, and the basic premise of terror management theory is that human beings have belief systems, and what the belief systems do is serve to protect them against death anxiety. And that's derived from the work of Ernest Becker, by the way, who wrote a great book called The Denial of Death. And his theories in The Denial of Death have been put to the test by the terror management theorists with, I would say, some success. But I think the theory is flawed because I don't believe that Becker phrased the issue properly. I think it's deeper than a fear of death, and that's what the existentialists are attempting to communicate. It's more like terror of isolated being. You know, it's not only that you're mortal, you know, that you have a border a temporal border, you're born and you die, but also that during that time you're vulnerable to all sorts of things and all sorts of contingencies, one of which of course is death, but it's by no means the only one that is horrifying. I think you can certainly make a case, like the existentialists do, that the mere fact that you're limited in the face of infinite complexity is also a primary existential problem. It's a problem that human beings have been dealing with ever since they started to understand, they started to make sense of concepts that were beyond their immediate experience. You know, millions of years ago, or tens of millions of years ago, when our ancestors lived in trees, you could be sure that they were frightened of what surrounded them. They were frightened of, when they were little, they were frightened of birds that might pick them out of a tree, or they were afraid of cats that might climb a tree and eat them. They were afraid of snakes that would come slithering along and bite them. And they existed in a space that was safe, surrounded by a space that wasn't safe, that was full of predatory entities. And those were primarily birds of prey and cats and snakes or other reptiles. And then what seemed to have happened as we evolved was that the way we construed the world, you can think of the world as a safe place surrounded by the possibility of predation, but you can also think of the world as the known surrounded by the unknown. It's the same idea, except put up one level of abstraction. And the unknown has the same relationship to us in some sense that the territory of predators has relationship to us, and we use the same circuitry to represent the absolute unknown that we used so many millions of years ago to represent predators. Now it's more complicated for human beings because, first of all, we're not just prey animals, we're also predators. And so we're not only targets, but we're the thing that makes other thing targets, and we're also something that isn't only shaking in the face of the unknown because of its predatory element, maybe like a rabbit, but something that can explore the unknown and garner something of value as a consequence. And so we have this very paradoxical wiring, you might say. The unknown is partly terror, and that's the prepotent element of the unknown. So negative emotion for human beings is more powerful than positive emotion is, sort of dose for dose. And I think that's because you can be completely and utterly dead, but you can only be so much happier. And so it makes much more sense to be tilted to some degree towards sensitivity to negative emotion than it does to be tilted towards sensitivity for positive emotion. But it's also another one of those things that makes life rather intrinsically difficult, because negative emotions are commonplace and they're powerful, and they need to be, because otherwise you'd wander stupidly into something that would kill you. And it's better to be anxious than to be in pain or dead, even though it's not so good to be anxious. So for the existentialist, the fundamental quality of human existence is limitation in the face of incomprehensible complexity, and all of the things that stem from that. Existentialism is not a comprehensive philosophy or a way of life, but an endeavor to grasp reality. Existentialism is immersed in and arises directly out of man's anxiety, estrangement, and conflicts. This was written 60 years ago, and it was written, so it was aimed at Western audiences at that point. If you go back 100 years, you could make the case, or perhaps a little longer than that, you could make the case that the parts of the world that weren't Western were still reasonably well ensconced in traditional belief systems, and so those traditional belief systems provided an overarching canopy of meaning, that's one way of thinking about it, that was designed exactly to, you could say, rationalize, or you could say cope with or deal with, depending on your perspective, that existential anxiety. It gave significance to everything, it gave meaning to everything, and those are religious systems, let's say, but they came crashing down in the West in the late 1800s, and then increasingly everywhere else in the world. So the point at which we are now in time, it isn't reasonable to only consider this a pathology of the Western individual. It might even be the prime conflict that exists in the world right now between comprehensive and traditional religious systems, and a modern viewpoint that has this existential angst built into it as part of its nature. Maybe it's the price you pay for increased technological mastery and awareness, but it's a big price to pay. And the existentialists were concerned about that because they also believed that although the scientific method had given us immense technological power, the worldview that came along with it, which you could say in some sense is incidental to the method, but it doesn't matter, the worldview that came along with it was sufficiently powerful and objective and reductive to blow gaping holes in the meaning systems that protected us from our existential anxiety, and to open us up to the possibility, number one, of nihilism, which is really belief in nothing, and we'll talk about that more as we progress, or a proclivity towards rational totalitarianism, which would be, you might say, the extreme reaction to the threat of nihilism and the abandonment of classic belief systems. I think you still see that playing out everywhere. You certainly see it playing out in the universities right now, because there's huge ideological conflicts in the substructure of Western intellectual thinking, and people are, and this is very hard on young people, they're caught in part between an emergent nihilism that seems to be implicit in a materialist worldview and the temptation of radical ideologies. And neither of those options, I would say, is tenable. I mean, the nihilistic option leaves you with nothing, and that's not good, and that's an existential realization in some sense too, because if your life is fundamentally problematic without you being pathological, just as the essence of your life, then you need something to defend against that. You can't just have nothing, because all it does is leave you with the suffering that's implicit in your experience. And then to swing to a totalitarian system means that you don't even exist. Once you've done that, everything you say can be predicted. You're just the puppet of a rational scheme that has an explanation for everything, but that's really good for nothing except destruction, because it's too vague and abstracted to be used to actually solve any concrete problems. So this is the situation of modern people as far as the existentialists were concerned. And the people that I'm talking to you about specifically, I'm going to talk to you about Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, and I picked those people who aren't psychologists except in the broader sense, because I don't think there is anybody who, there were and are existential psychotherapists, but I don't think that any of them do as good a job of explaining the problem as those people do. So you might as well get the information right from the source. Like psychoanalysis, existentialism seeks to utilize these very conflicts as avenues to the more profound self-understanding of man. Well, so what does that mean? Well, it means, at least in part, that the theorists that we're going to talk about had an idea that was akin to the psychoanalytic idea of facing what you're afraid of. And that's a key concept in psychotherapy. There's not that many key concepts in psychotherapy. One might be that you enter into an honest relationship with your client. The second is that exposure to the things that you don't want to be exposed to is curative if it's voluntary. That's a big deal, and it has to be voluntary. It can't be involuntary, because that'll just make it worse. Because you might ask, well, you know, if a kid has a fear of rats or mice, they got that fear because often they were exposed to rats or mice, and then you use exposure to rats and mice to cure them. Well, that makes the precipitator of the illness the cure, which makes no sense. Well, what's the distinction? Well, it's one thing to have something pop up at you when you're not expecting it. That puts you in a state of apprehension and preparation for action, in a state of, even a state of terror, a state of reflexive shock, and then perhaps terror, and maybe something you don't recover from. That's completely different than facing something voluntarily. The psychophysiology isn't even the same. So if you're faced with a stressor of a certain magnitude and it's involuntary, your body produces a lot of the stress hormone cortisol. And in large doses, cortisol is toxic, especially if it's produced over long periods of time. But if you face it voluntarily, then that doesn't happen. You use a completely different set of circuits to do something voluntarily. And it's the utilization of the voluntary circuits that indicates your mastery over the thing that you're afraid of, and that mastery over the thing that you're afraid of and can't cope with, that actually constitutes your adaptive personality. And so part of what the existentialists were suggesting is that precisely, and you see this in Freud with his insistence that you go into your messy past and dig up the corpses and the skeletons and sort them out, and Jung's insistence that what you want most is to be found where you least want to look, and Rogers' insistence that people communicate honestly about difficult things. It's all predicated on the same idea, in some sense, that voluntary exposure is one of the prime things that cures people. And one of the things that you should think about, you think, well, is that a valid claim? Well, you have the psychophysiological evidence, but it's also the case that that is how people learn, right? If you're a child and you're learning to master the world, you actually exist in a state of existential anxiety unless you're near someone that will take care of you. So for example, if you take the typical child and you go to a mall, say a 3-year-old, and then you have the 3-year-old stand and you leave, it isn't going to be very long till you're far enough away so that most children in that situation will immediately start to cry. They'll get worried and they'll start to cry, and then they'll break down because that's the existential anxiety. Like you think, well, a normal child is calm. It's like, wrong. A normal child close to someone who will take care of them is calm, but that is by no means the same thing. It's not even close to the same thing. And so you get backwards in your psychological thinking if you don't notice that, because you think, well, the normal human being is calm and well put together. It's like, no, wrong. The normal human being in a place of safety is calm and well put together. But why you would ever think that a normal place is a place of safety, assuming that that's the standard or the norm, there's absolutely no reason for that. You see this with rats too, because the behaviorists, for example, made the presumption that you had to teach rats to be afraid. But let me tell you how that actually worked. It's really interesting, and it shows you how carefully you have to analyze, say, psychological experiments to understand what's going on. So let's say you take a lab rat, okay, and let's say it's a lab rat like a rat that Skinner used, B.F. Skinner, who was the most famous of the behaviorists, and he could get rats to do anything. He taught pigeons to play ping pong. He taught pigeons to guided missiles by photographs, and he did that with behavioral training. They were never used for guided missiles because they got the electronics working before the program was set into operation. But he could get them to peck at photos to guide something that was flying accurately, and he did that with behavioral training. So Skinner, I mean, he was no joke. He really knew how to train animals, and it's very useful material to know. We'll talk about it to some degree if you want to train children, for example, or pets. So, because the learning mechanisms are very similar, which is why, of course, we can get along with pets, right? We understand them like we understand children, roughly speaking. So, anyways, so let's say you've got your rat and he's sitting there and he's pretty calm and he's in his cage. And so he's already a weird rat because he's been genetically altered. He's not a wild Norway rat. So he's a little tamer than a normal rat. Maybe he's a little more fearful, although perhaps not. And he's also a solitary rat in his cage, and there's no such thing as a solitary rat. It's like a solitary zebra or a solitary carp, not carp, cod. Cod exist in huge schools. There's no such thing as a cod, which is why they will never come back, as far as I can tell, because once you wipe out the school, it's like you wipe out a beehive and you're going to have 6 bees. What the hell are you going to do with 6 bees? What are they going to do? They don't exist on their own. And herd animals are like that too, and cod are like that. So they organize their mating behavior in their huge schools. So without the schools, like, what the hell is a cod going to do? Nothing. And that is what they're doing. But anyways, back to the rat. So you've got this rat, he's in a cage, he's alone, and he's hungry, because one of the things that Skinner did was starve his rats down to 75% of their normal body weight so that they would respond a lot more to food. So that's the model, and that you got to keep in mind the nature of the model, because the model is like, the way the model is constituted is equivalent to your implicit assumptions about your experiment, and people don't take that into consideration. Okay, so the rat's calm. So then what you do is you take the rat out of his cage and you put him in the testing chamber. And so maybe what you're going to do is you're going to set the rat up so that a light goes on and then he gets a little electric shock, okay? And that you're going to teach him to be afraid of the light. So after you pair the light with the shock 6 or 7 times, when the light comes on, the rat's going to freeze. So, and he freezes because he's using predator avoidance strategy basically to deal with the threat. But, and so you think, well, calm rat learns to be afraid. But no, because when you put the rat in the cage, the new cage, what does it do? Well, it doesn't just, find the sofa and have a nap. It's terrified when you put it in the new situation. That's the normal rat. It's the one that's like this. It doesn't move, because if it moved, maybe a predator would pick it out, like a cat, because cats can see lateral movement. That's why they have slit eyes, by the way, so they can detect lateral movement. And you know that because if you play with your cat like this, it'll chase your hand, but if you do this, it won't. It's because it doesn't chase things that do this. It doesn't chase kangaroos, it chases things that move like this, so it has eyes for that. Anyways, the rat's frozen, and then it starts to sniff, because a rat is all smell. The brains of most animals are organized around smell. Human beings are very weird, because our brains are organized around vision. But that's just not the case for most, dogs. They're the weirdest things, because they can smell like way better than you. They can detect odors way better than you. Probably most of you smell better than a dog. But they can detect odors better than you. But everything seems to smell good to a dog, which is the strangest damn thing, With a nose like that, you'd think they'd never even want to go outside. But anyways. Uh-oh. Now I probably lost my place. All right. Dogs, smell. Where were we going with that? Rats. Yes. And what's that? Frozen, yes, okay, so the rat, that's the one. So the rat is in its cage, and it's frozen so that nothing can see it and eat it. And so it starts to sniff, because it uses smell to see what's going on. And so if you take rats that have never been exposed to a cat, and you, blow cat odor over them, they do not like that at all. They do not like cat odor, so it's built right into, it's an archetype. The predator cat is an archetype for the rat, and it doesn't need any pre-training to respond to it. And it's probably also the case with human beings and things like snakes and looming objects. We've got some archetypal predators as well. But, all right, so the rat sniffs, and then if nothing happens, it thinks, okay, a rat can sniff here without dying. And so then it starts to relax a little bit, and maybe it starts to move around a bit, and then it thinks, okay, a sniffing rat that's moving a little bit can live here without dying. And then nothing else happens, and so it relaxes a bit more, and then it starts to sniff its way around, and it'll sniff all around the cage and check out all the corners and make sure that there isn't anything there that can eat it, because the rat actually cares about that. And then when it's completely explored the cage and decided that it's safe, then it turns into a normal, calm rat. But that's post-exploration. So you have to say, well, a rat that has thoroughly explored its territory is a calm rat. That's a whole different way of looking about fear. Then you turn the light on and shock it, and the rat thinks, wrong. It's not safe here, and that light indicates that it's not safe. So basically what you've done is remind the rat that life is dangerous. You have not taught it fear. It's not the same thing. The rat knows everything about fear. It learned that it was safe, and it was wrong. And that's a really important thing to understand also about what you're like. Because like anxiety, that needs no explanation. Depression, that needs no explanation. What needs explanation is, how the hell do you ever feel secure and together ever? Because that's the mystery. And partly the way you do that is by never going anywhere where you're upset. You stay in your territory. And so this is your territory, and everyone knows how to act here, right? So you look around and everyone's sitting and doing exactly the same thing, so you can ignore them. You can pretend that they're not dangerous. And most of the time, that will be correct. And some of the time, it won't be. And so you maintain your emotional stability by staying where you belong. And that's quite different than the psychoanalytic view, that you're calm and well put together if your psyche is properly organized. It's like, this is partly why I introduce you guys to Piaget, because Piaget adds this other element. He says something like, yeah, well, your psyche has to be organized properly, so you have to have turned everything that is a constituent element of you into a functional being, but that being has to be integrated in a functional game-like landscape made of other people who are doing the same thing, and then it's the concordance between your structure and that landscape that makes you emotionally regulated. That's a way different theory. It's a much more sophisticated theory. So you could say in some sense the psychoanalysts had it half right. You know, and also you can be individually pathological in a way that doesn't let you fit into society. But you have to understand the concordance between the social organization and the individual organization to get the picture right. Well, so what do the existentialists say? Well, it's something like, in the depths of your existential terror, the wisdom to cope with that terror will be found. So that's the fundamental idea. And then there's a more profound idea in that, which I would also say is implicit in psychotherapy. The more behavioral the psychotherapy, the more implicit it is. But the idea is that despite the fact that you are mismatched, that you're outmatched by, let's call it existential complexity, there's something in you that's far more complex than you know. And if you challenge it, it will respond by growing and developing, and that will not protect you against the existential anxiety. It's not like a shield or a guard that you're hiding behind. It's not a defense. What happens instead is that you actually learn how to deal with it, you know. So you think about it this way. One of the things that human beings are archetypally related to is fire. And of course, fire is something to be afraid of because it will burn you and it will burn everything down. But by the same token, when we mastered fire, which may have been 2 million years ago, something like that, because it looks like it was about then that we learned how to cook, which made a big difference. So you know how chimps, I haven't told you the chimp story, I don't think. You know how chimps are sort of shaped like this? They've got this huge barrel-shaped body. Well, yeah, they spend like 12 hours a day chewing leaves. And why is that? Because you go out in the forest and eat leaves and see how much you have to chew so you don't starve to death. It's like leaves aren't edible. They hardly have any nourishment at all. And so if you're a chimp, all you do is sit around and chew leaves. And then you need to have an intestinal tract that could wrap 2 or 3 times around this room so that you can digest the damn things, right? So that's chimp life. Well, human beings, we decided to trade intestinal length for brain. And the way we did that was by learning how to cook. And we mastered fire. And so you might say, well, is fire dangerous? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on how you react to it. It's exactly that, right? You say, well, fire is intrinsically dangerous. It's like, no, fire is multivalent. It has all sorts of possibilities, and some of them are extraordinarily destructive. But if you match your behavior properly to the phenomena, then you can master something like fire. Well, so the idea is that there's a potential inside you, whatever inside means, there's a potential that's part of you. Some of it's genetic potential, and we know that because if we move you into a new environment, new genes will turn on inside of you and manufacture new parts of you. So if you stress yourself optimally, if you push yourself out into the world, you can incorporate information from that journey, the exploration. That's a Piagetian idea, right? You go out and you learn something new and you adjust your behavior to it, and you adjust your concepts to it, and then you can master it. But what Piaget didn't realize was that it also transforms your biological structure at a microscopic level merely as a consequence of being put in the new situation. So the idea is that there's more to you than you know, and the way you call it out is by challenging yourself voluntarily in as many directions as you can manage. And that's a real thing. It isn't the construction of defenses. It's not something artificial like defense against death anxiety. It's actually how you learn to cope in the world. And the existentialists, I would say, despite their exceptional pessimism, were in some sense unbelievably optimistic, because what they would say, it's the opposite of a straw man argument. They would say, well, how weak are human beings? Ultimately weak. We're up against an opponent, so to speak, a social opponent, say, which would be the crushing weight of society, and a natural opponent that is nature, which overwhelms you. We're up against the ultimate opponent. And so in that sense, we're extraordinarily weak, but it turns out that if we face that opponent or that series of opponents, then all sorts of possibilities manifest themselves inside of us, and it isn't clear what the upper limits are to that. So it's so interesting that it's a good example of how if you face what you're afraid of, you can find what you need. You say, well, the existentialists make the strongest case possible for the vulnerability of human beings, and out of that, they extract out the strongest case possible why human beings are strong and powerful.